All right. Now can you hear me? All right. Let me try this again then and see if you can.
Colonists find themselves working together against a common.
New Jersey
Yes, that's better. We can hear you.
are very much into this war effort. I don't know that anybody's ever really calculated this, but my guess would be that there are about 60,000 armed Anglo-Americans who are closing in on New France, which has only 75,000 people in it. And that is what leads to the conquest of New France by 1760. It really is decisive. It really does change the face of North America.
What role does Spain, the other major power on the North American continent, play in this conflict?
Usually Spain and France had been allies in these wars against Britain. Spain decided to remain neutral in the Seven Years' War. And for bizarre reasons, what we're beginning to learn is they're afraid of the British. They're also afraid of the French. So Spain decided to sit this one out until about early 1762, after the fall of New France, after the French have lost two of their major sugar islands. So the British just turn their juggernaut against the Spanish and take Havana and take Manila in the Philippines. And finally, the Spanish say, let's make peace. And they do make peace. And actually, in order to get Havana back, they turn Florida over to the British.
By the end of the war, British holdings in North America have changed dramatically.
They picked up half of Louisiana. They got the half that was on the eastern bank of the Mississippi, whereas the French gave the western half of Louisiana to their Spanish allies as a consolation prize for having fought with them and lost. The British got everything east of the Mississippi and north of the Great, while the French were evicted from North America. But of course, in the great heart of North America, the great sweep of most of this geography, the inhabitants were primarily Indians who were not consulted in this peace treaty and who thought of the European presence in their midst, a few forts, a few trading posts, as their permission.
England finds itself at peace for the first time in more than 50 years. But it's an uncertain peace.
But it was in large part their success in the 7 Years' War that created a lot of problems for them, because they gained a continent, or half a continent anyway, and it was a continent with a lot of built-in problems.
The imperial authorities came away from the war convinced that they needed to solidify their huge investment in saving the colonies from the French in Canada by asserting a much clearer control over the colonies. The colonists, on the other hand, felt that they had given huge amounts of manpower, they had made financial contributions, they felt that they had earned an equal place within the empire.
Again, if you look at Pitt's subsidy system, what's now 133,000 pounds a year, well, the British after the war are spending over 400,000 pounds a year on the British Army and artillery and Indian presence. 133 would have been some bargain, it seems to me, and it would have encouraged the colonists to participate actively and voluntarily in this system. Instead, they demobilize all of the provincials, decide to run the West only with the British Army. I think they have very good intentions in all of this. For one thing, they assumed that the settlers would antagonize the Indians sooner rather than later. What they didn't realize was that the army was already doing that. And so basically the British provoke this massive Indian resistance, Pontiac's War in 1763-64, in which almost every garrison in the West is overrun in 1763. The big exceptions were Detroit and Niagara and Fort Pitt, and they all did manage to hold out.
Primarily, the Indians object to traders and settlers moving onto lands they consider their own. The British government attempts to control the situation by issuing the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlers from advancing into territory west of the Appalachian Mountains.
It didn't actually stop people getting up and going. If you wanted to go out and take up squatters' rights, you could do it, and a lot of people did. In fact, a lot of people did so in order to leave behind various debts or bad marriages. Daniel Boone, who becomes famous as the founder of Kentucky, was fleeing a sheriff's warrant for debt in Virginia. The sheriff subpoena says, gone to Kentucky, absconded to Kentucky. So actual people going over the mountains didn't stop. What the proclamation did do, however, and this bothered the planters a lot, was invalidate any potential land titles so that you could not open up land legally and have a valid claim to it. It meant that you couldn't develop that land.
To station agents and supervisors of the Indian territories to manage settlement in a controlled way, to keep antagonisms with the natives from building up, and in general, to assure a tranquil life there so that they wouldn't have wars to fight in the borderland. And on the whole, they failed. I mean, there was constant uproar in these areas. The British government, in a time period in which they were trying to exert many different kinds of control over North America, political and economic, as well as control of the territories, were failing to maintain control over the newly opened lands.
It is in part to pay for the cost of administering this new continental empire that the British begin enacting a series of financial revenue acts in 1764.
Because you're growing rapidly. The population doubles every generation. Eventually, you should be able to pay all the cost of your defense. But for now, let's just start with the Sugar Act, which is mostly a tax on molasses coming from the French islands, and the Stamp Tax, Stamp Act of 1765, which is mostly a tax on legal documents, almost self-enforcing, because the Act says that these documents will be of no legal force unless they are printed on stamped paper.
As to the Stamp Act, the first bad consequences attending it I take to be this: our courts of judicature must inevitably be shut up, for it is impossible, or next of kin to it under our present circumstances, that the Act of Parliament can be complied with, were we ever so willing to enforce the execution. For not to say, which alone would be sufficient, that we have not money to pay the stamps, I fancy the merchants of Great Britain to the colonies will not be among the last to wish for a repeal of it.
And the question was, well, does Parliament have the authority to do all of this? And Parliament said, well, we don't see any difference between passing the Navigation Acts back in the 17th century and passing the Sugar Act tax or the Stamp Act tax today. And the colonists are saying, no, there's got to be some distinction of what Parliament can do and what Parliament can't do. But on the whole, they'll concede the power of Parliament to regulate their trade. But they do increasingly say, you can't tax us for revenue.
One reason the British were so baffled by the Americans' behavior was this was a people not at all oppressed. They were much less heavily taxed than the British, than people living in Britain were. They had their own self-government. They had considerable leeway in all kinds of ways. The colonial assemblies had a great deal of power and indeed seemed to have gained in power over the course of the 18th century. And Americans, so when they looked at the Americans, they thought, what are these people complaining about? They've got everything they could want. And even the Americans thought that to a surprising degree.
The series of crises that marked the 1760s eventually subside, not because of resolutions by colonial assemblies or riots in American cities, but because economic pressures force England to back down.
The northern colonies, it appears, are endeavoring to adopt this scheme. In my opinion, it is a good one, provided that it can be carried pretty generally into execution. If the gentlemen in their several counties would be at some pains to explain matters to the people, and stimulate them to a cordial agreement to purchase none but certain enumerated articles out of any of the stores after such a period, not import nor purchase any themselves. This, if it did
the movement to boycott British goods could bring together people for very different reasons. The Virginia planters supported the boycott because here was an excuse not to spend lots of money they didn't have without surrendering the appearance of wealth and gentility. In Massachusetts, in New England, generally, also the boycott was widely supported. But there was a strong impetus, a strong motivation grounded in a kind of moral reformation. If Britain was given over to luxury and vice and laziness and corruption, Americans could self-sacrificing, frugal, lean and mean in a way. And so here we have support for the boycott for very different reasons.
One of the ways of looking at the revolution is to see Great Britain embarking on what is ultimately a self-fulfilling not just prophecy, but nightmare. Almost everything that they're doing after 1763 is driving the colonists to a position where the colonists were not going on their own.
There was a concerted effort to get rid of the duties that were imposed by, called the Townsend duties at the end of the 60s, in which, again, brought people together in committees that became consolidated within certain provinces and then became trans-provincial and finally continental sized. But the basic force that was at work through these years was a buildup of apprehension, of fear, that they were being subjected to a familiar kind of political pressure, which would end in the destruction of what they prided themselves on as British liberties. And the way the British government managed these apprehensions, or rather failed to, is one of the key elements in this whole history.
There's one crisis after another. The British take one action, the Americans see it in a certain way. The British pull back a little bit. Then they try something else a couple of years later. The Americans are outraged by that. And every one is one more nail in the faith that Americans have in this particular British ministry or this particular British crown.
An event in Boston ignites colonial resentment to a new level of intensity.
It's a clash between really working class people in the city of Boston and one of the bodies of British troops that had been brought in to care in what had become one of the most disorderly of the American cities in the colonies. A group of workmen, and there were a sizable number of blacks and mulattoes, mixed bloods, black with some white blood, confront a body of British troops and begin to taunt them for attacking and taking away the liberties of Americans who should be treated like free Englishmen. And it leads to a riot and a clash in which the British troops fire on this group of what they will see as rabble. And they will kill people who were either slaves or runaway slaves or recently freed blacks, along with free whites. And African Americans from that moment, that they were participants at the beginning of that struggle for liberty. Crispus Attucks, a mulatto, who was one of probably the rowdiest of the workmen, is among the first to die. And blacks will claim that they shed some of the earliest in what now begins to be the fight for freedom from Great Britain.
Although the next 3 years appear relatively calm, growing resistance simmers just below the surface.
When they saw things like the stationing of troops in a peaceful area such as happened in Boston in 1768, when they saw a very small episode but which became in their minds very aggravating, what is thought of as the Boston Massacre, where 5 people were shot by the troops, where they saw customs officers clamping down control that hadn't been there before, where they saw controls of the judicial system that hadn't been there before, where they saw courts were being transplanted to different areas in order to keep away from the pressure of local political groups. When they saw many things of this kind building up over the years, it fit a pattern of what they considered to be tyranny in free states. And the buildup of opposition was initially slow, but it grew in ways that became more and more consolidated.
This was a more diversified society, and a society that was in fact had significant groups that were not culturally identified with England. The Scots-Irish didn't like the English. The Germans clearly were not identified with the English. So those are forms of divergence. Another problem that arises in the way in which Americans thought about themselves is the very dynamism and growth of the American economy and American society. There were elements, there were aspects of British society and culture that were no longer good fits with the American colonies. The fact that the American economy and population growing so quickly and dynamically meant that it was no longer so easily corralled within the British economic system, and that the Navigation Acts or the mercantilist policies, the customs regulations, all of these things they pinch more and more as the American colonies grow.
What is it we are contending against? Is it against paying the duty of 3 pence per pound on tea because burthensome? No, it is the right only we have all along disputed. I think the Parliament of Great Britain hath no more right to put their hands into my pocket without my consent, then I have to put my hands in yours for money. And this being already urged to them in a firm but decent manner by all the colonies, what reason is there to expect anything from their justice?
To jump ahead to 1774, after the Bostonians, rather than pay the tax on tea, they dumped these 340 plus chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This, though, happens in December, just as Parliament is coming into session in London, and so the British reaction is very swift. The British decide, well, what are we going to do about this? Well, they have a range of choices, and the simplest was, all right, let's shut down the port of Boston until the tea is paid for. And that law is the first one that passes. And there's a gap of several months before they pass the Massachusetts Government Act, which basically voids the Massachusetts Second Charter of 1691 and imposes a conventional royal government on Massachusetts.
In response to these two intolerable acts, the First Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia. At this early stage, Congress doesn't think of itself as a government.
It's trying to develop principled resistance to the so-called intolerable acts, or what Parliament called the coercive acts. A program adopted by the First Continental Congress, which was supposed to get Parliament to back it down and restore peace, didn't work. A few regiments had now been sent to Boston, who was to intimidate the whole colony. What happened was that the colony intimidated the army, and the army is really confined to just Boston. So the royal governor, General Gage, in Boston, controlled Boston and Charlestown across Boston Harbor, and nothing else. And the settlers, through their various voluntary mechanisms, control the rest of the colony.
General Gage receives orders to assert his authority, to gain control of the interior. But Gage hesitates, with good reason.
They're massing supplies at Concord inland, where the Navy can't get at them. So send an army slowly by night to go out there and take all of those, and if possible, arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And what they find, that they're lucky that they are able, the British, to get the expedition back to Boston, and without sending over 1,000 reinforcements, which met them at Lexington, they probably would have all been wiped out, those in the original expedition. So that's what starts the war, Parliament's effort to take over the internal affairs of a particular colony, and they didn't have the resources to do it.
The buildup of animosity over the years we're talking about, 1760, 1776, over this period of time, came out of a sense of fear, largely on the part of political leaders, and one has to say leaders, because the whole population was not deeply involved at this, especially at the start, but people in public life, sensitive to public movements and the possibilities of what would happen in public life, increasingly felt apprehension about what they saw the British government was doing.
You could look at a number of points in the 60s and 70s and say, if the British had been so high-handed, if the British had recognized early on what they were dealing with, had the Americans and the British found ways to compromise, because there were a number of these plans, sure, they could have gotten through the 60s and the 70s. But I think that there are deeper structural problems that have to do with the growth and sophistication of American society that would have made it increasingly difficult and uncomfortable for Americans to sit calmly within an imperial system.
It is not immediately clear to the British, and even to many Americans, that the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord are the first battles of a war. Many see them as simply another example of the tensions that have been plaguing Anglo-American relations for years. But whether or not they recognize it, the British and Americans have taken a decisive step. The war for independence has begun.
All right, so that's pretty much all we have for today. Do you guys have any questions about MindTap or the document analysis? Also, Ms. Dawkins, I sent your paper back with some something you should look at. Elia Bacon? Yeah, I'm sorry.
If once we open the MindTap quizzes, can we close them and come back to them still?
No. Got to do them all in one sitting.
Okay.
Also, when you do them, it's going to show like an asterisk where the grade is until after tomorrow midnight when they're due. It'll tell you what you got after midnight tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. Anybody else? Yes, Brooklyn?
Yes, I just had a question about what time the document analysis was due tonight.
Yes, it is due at 11:59, but there's on Blackboard there's a mistake. So let me fix it right now, because it says on some of them it says 10:59. So no, it is 11:59, and I am checking right now to make sure yours is correct.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mhm. Anybody else? There, yep, it says 10. Okay, so there we go. I fixed it. Y'all's is fixed. It's 11:59 p.m. this evening. All right. How long does the doc analysis have to be? 2 to 3 pages. Tima, Yamani?
Yes, I have a question, please. So
Yes.
I didn't quite understand what is the difference on the Mind tab now? So the only
Okay.
difference that you cannot see the grades or something else?
Yeah, you cannot see your responses, whether they're correct or not, until after the due date has passed. The Mind Tap, you only get one attempt, and they're only open on Fridays and Saturdays now.
Okay, but can I do half of them today, half of them tomorrow, or I
No,
have to do it at the
you
same
have to
time?
do the whole test at the same time.
Okay. Okay, thank
Okay.
you. Okay.
All right. Anybody else? As long as you guys put your name in the chat, you can go. Class is over. That video, if you did want to review it or anything, it's on YouTube. It's on my YouTube channel. Jaden Black?
I just wanted to know, how should I cite? I'm doing the Ann Foster.
Confession?
And yeah, is it like since it's like dated, kind of like as the trial went, what is it
It's
considered?
probably a government document. Like it's probably a trial transcript. Let me pull it up real quick.
Okay.
What folder is it in? Is it in 2 and 4 or 1 and 3?
1 and 3.
Okay.
And it's the very last one on
Okay.
the document.
All right. Let me. Okay. Not that one. Okay, here we go. The examination and confession of Ann Foster at Salem. Okay, so it's the examination of one of the young women before a judge. So it's going to be the court document.
It kind of broke up there at the end.
I'm sorry. Okay, it's going to be a court document. It's a government document.
Okay.
So you're going to cite it as a government document.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Sure. Okay. Anybody else? Asada?
Yes, Professor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah, I had emailed you a few days about the plagiarism check, and I know you've had a lot of emails come through, so I know you're kind of dealing with that. So I submitted the assignment through the document analysis through the Turnitin, but should I have waited for like your approval? Because I know that I wanted to make sure that I cited all my sources correctly, or should I just like I don't know, like let you know and then take it
No,
down and then
I
resubmit or?
Well, I responded to you this morning.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, so go back and look at that. If you do want to change anything, just let me know and I can clear out the first paper you submitted and then you can resubmit.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right.
Okay. Tima?
Yes, sorry, professors. I have another question.
Yes.
About the document analysis, is there a written paper that we can follow to see if our analysis is complete, or we should only see the video? Because I want to recheck after finishing the paper.
Uh-huh.
So is there like another guide that you have to follow or only the video?
No, there's a guide. If you go to document analysis, there's a link there that says guide for analysis,
Yeah,
and
the
it's a PDF.
help table,
I'm sorry?
the table of the questions.
Yes. Just make sure that you've answered all those questions and you should be fine.
Oh, so that's it.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Uh-huh.
Have a good day. Bye.
You too. Anyone else? Okay. If you have any other questions that weren't answered in class today, go ahead and email me and I will respond back to you as soon as I can. Again, you can always view the class sessions on Blackboard and or on YouTube. And y'all have a good weekend.